welcome everyone to what I hope will be a really interesting discussion and think will be. We are here to talk about the publication of an exciting new book called Settling Climate Accounts, Navigating the Road to Net Zero. And we're here to do so at a pretty important time. Before I get into that, let me introduce our four panelists, and then we will jump right in. First, we have the two editors of the book, Alicia Seiger and Tom Heller. They can wave hi and you can see them there. And Alicia is a GSB grad and works in many various functions at Stanford regarding climate finance. Tom Heller is an emeritus law professor at Stanford and also works in various functions at Stanford leading climate finance related efforts. We also have Meg Starr, a GSB grad from 2015, who is at, as you will hear much more about, the Carlyle Group. Meg, you want to say hi? There you go. And Nan Ransohoff, also GSB 15, who is leading climate efforts at Stripe. And you will hear more about that too. Hi, Nan, thanks for being with us. So I just want to tell you a little bit how we're going to do this. We're going to have effectively an hour-long conversation, and we're going to invite you all to be part of that conversation. So as Allegra asked, what I would ask you all to do is to submit questions, and please do it by addressing your question to everyone in the Zoom chat. That way I'll be able to see all the questions, and I'll be able to try to do some consolidating as we go along. There will be plenty of opportunity both for you to pose your questions and for your questions more broadly to guide the discussion. So we're going to jump right in, but I just want to say, at the risk of repeating what probably all of you know to be true, which is probably why you're here, that we're here at a time of huge disconnect in the effort to deal with climate change. On the one hand, hugely rising consciousness about the threat of climate change on the level of corporates, investors, governments, and consumers. On the other hand, not a lot of evidence of increasing effectiveness in dealing with climate change. And I'm going to ask Alicia to jump in a moment, but I want to do it in the following way. Alicia, I was reading the preface to the book, and you and Tom talk in your preface about three turns. You talk about, this is three turns for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of reading the preface yet, three turns in the history of the global effort to deal with climate change, and more specifically in the global effort to deal with climate change in a financial sense. You talk about the turn to green finance, and then the turn to risk, and now the turn to net zero. And we will focus a lot of what we talk about in the next hour on the turn to net zero, but it strikes me that there's one turn that's not happening, and that is the turn to lower emissions. Which is sort of the point of it all, right? So tell us kind of where we are at this moment when everyone seems to be promising, every company on the planet, every government on the planet seems to be promising that they're going to go to net zero by mid-century. Most of them aren't telling us how they're going to do it. Most of them aren't telling us what they actually mean by mid-century. And yet we're supposed to believe that this is a hugely important moment. So what should we take from this? And give us a sense of kind of how the book attacks this.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for that nice introduction. And thank you all for Zooming in today. It's really a pleasure to be here. And especially want to thank Nan and Meg for jumping in to talk about this book, but it ties so cleanly to their work. And I've enjoyed so much getting to know them over the years. So thank you for joining us. So to your question, Jeff, I mean, this arrival at the moment of net zero as the leading organizing principle for climate action really evolved over 3 decades of ups and downs, mostly downs. But I think we can think of this moment marked by a shift in the types of actors that are thinking deeply about climate. So we've kind of gone from scientists to business leaders and from policymakers to investors. And that's kind of driven by a number of factors, but I think, you can look at it in terms of business opportunity or competition for talent or a growing sense of the economic, social, and moral costs of inaction. And I've actually seen at the GSB, I've been back now for a decade, and I used to have a small cohort of maybe 5 students that were interested in climate. And now, this year's class has over 100 students that are, self-selecting into climate content. And so this shift was sort of a transition from what, had been originally framed as an environmental problem became increasingly understood, particularly by leaders in business and finance, as a capital allocation problem. And in thinking of it that way, we've made progress in some senses. The cost of renewables is way down, EVs way down, battery costs are plummeting, huge inflows of capital into climate tech and climate-related products. As you said, from the headlines from COP, we've got now $130 trillion of capital aligned with net zero by 2050. And our messengers have gone from Al Gore and Bill McKibben to Larry Fink and Janet Yellen. But as you said, progress hasn't gone nearly far enough, and we're running out of time. Climate is a time test. And so to solve this capital allocation problem, we need better data, we need better products, and we need much greater accountability. And so that's what this book is about. And in coming to the articulation of the three turns, we articulated these to help people understand how we arrived in this moment. And these turns start from 2009 in Copenhagen, which really was the COP that fundamentally shook the world's faith in the original hope of multilateral climate negotiations. And this turn to green finance was characterized by the belief that we could just buy our way to 1.5 or 2 degrees, let the market do the work. The turn to risk is characterized by the realization that the market won't take us far enough, particularly certain technologies and geographies. So we need to better understand, sort of invert the lens on what it's going to cost not to do it. And then this turn to net zero, where we are now, in some ways combines the two, but risks taking the easy road by shortcutting what is hard about both of those turns. So it skirts the challenges of transitioning systems on the green finance side by ignoring the distribution of gains and losses of winding down legacy industries. And then it also has this emphasis on emissions alignment, which, to your point of how come we've got all this activity and not real emissions reductions, and that may be because we're lining up emissions with normative targets without dealing with the tough, granular, and strategic challenges of managing risk. And to come just to the punchline of your question, like why is that and what's gone wrong here? We surfaced 4 unsettled accounts in this investigation of net zero in practice that points to the reasons why we're still stalling here. And those, just to preview them, and we of course should get into them more in discussion, is data. So there's just so much noise in the system and lack of comparability that there's high risk of greenwashing. There's issues of coverage and boundaries. So it's very unclear where and how to draw the lines of carbon accounting. This is embodied in the questions around Scope 3 emissions. Timing. So the challenges of managing global carbon stocks and flows over time. This is embodied in the debate about offsets. And then obligations. What's a well-intended actor supposed to do with all this new climate information? And this is where, Nan and Meg are great spokespeople for that question.
So that's fascinating, and I want to shift to Tom, but I want to do it in this way. For those of you who are listening and haven't had your second cup of coffee, if you think Alicia's wonking out, talking about the 4 areas that need to be worked on in order for this moment to be something other 10 years down the road than yet another lost moment dealing with climate change. What I'd like all of you, Alicia, Tom, Meg, and Nan, to think about as we have this conversation is what's necessary here more tactical, or is it still really strategic? In other words, has the world gotten religion on climate change? Has capitalism gotten religion on climate change? And is now all that needs to happen just working out the kinks? Or is just working out the kinks not just working out the kinks, because it could rise or fall on whether the kinks get worked out? Or is this notion of a sort of grand realization about climate change, about the severity of the threat and the importance and the opportunity of do something about it and the risk of not doing something about it, is that so fundamentally different from what has preceded this moment? Is it not so fundamentally different, such that we could fall back from the immediacy? And Tom, I want to ask you that question because you're the one here who has the longest view, having been at Rio in '92 and COP since then. So just kind of position for us your sense of, forget the rhetoric here, the sort of hyperbole about where we are. Where are we and where are we not in terms of concern about climate change in a way that has political legs and in terms of capitalism's sophistication in dealing with it?
Good morning, everyone who's out there, and pleasure to be on this panel. My answer is we've come a long way since 1992. It's very important to understand where we are now, and then most importantly, where we're going at this juncture. On the last question, it's not just technical. Okay, I mean, people have realized the enormous threat that climate change poses, both to their physical property, their households, their business assets, to the value chains that constitute an economy, and they are serious about this all over the world. I work a lot in China, as you do, and there is no difference in perception of how important this problem is in any part of the world. On the other hand, I think the answer to the question that you pose, is this fundamentally like other challenges? No, in the sense that what this is really about is accelerating and supporting a fundamental transition in the economy to more productive, because we continue to need growth given the amount of poverty in the world and across the world. The transition has to be equitable, and there is more talk of just transition, which is happening to highlight the fact of the equity, the difficulties in industries, communities, nations that have built their own form of modernity in some way around high carbon industries. And of course, this transition has to be resilient. And I'll simply close this particular response by saying that we have had transitions in the past in which economies fundamentally moved around technological innovation and the adjustment of business models, the adjustment of policy systems, the adjustment of financial structures to adapt to these new technologies. But we've never tried to do it with the rate of acceleration that is caused by the damage function, which has become so apparent. So on the one hand, the realizations of consciousness across the world are much higher than they were. Net zero, in part, is a response to the mainstreaming and the engagement of private actors in this realization. But the recognition of what the problem is, the risks that are posed, both on the downside and the possibilities of installing in a timely way these new low carbon production systems in key sectors of the economy. And finally, the timing of how you wind down one economy and wind up another in its place are fundamentally different, because we don't have 150 years to manage this transition as we did much of the rest of industrialization.
So I'm gonna resist the urge to plumb a lot of that, and we'll come back and do that, both Alicia and Tom and Megan Nan. But I want to bring Megan Nan into this, and I do think that Tom's last point is probably not new to most people on this call, but really crucial for all of us to think about, which is to say that not only don't we have 150 years, but if you're a corporate promiser, you've just given yourself 30 years. And if you're a climate scientist, you've just given the world fewer than 10 years. So that's the kind of game we're talking about here. Meg, let's start with you. Meg, you graduated, as did Nan, from the GSB in 2015, which was, for the climate diplomacy geeks out there, the year of the Paris Climate Conference. I'm going to assume that you graduated from the GSB having become convinced that climate change was a really huge issue that you wanted to spend a lot of time in. And I guess I want to ask you two questions. One is, what's the difference between what you thought working in a huge financial firm dealing with climate change was going to be like and what it is like? Answer that first, and then we'll get into the guts of Carlyle.
Thanks, Jeff. And I have to say that it wasn't necessarily GSB that convinced me, but I was raised by left-wing environmental guerrillas that are fully off the grid. So I would say it has to be in my DNA.
What do they think about the fact that you're working for Carlyle?
I had to write them a few sentence description of what my job is. Exactly what I do every day. But they get the point of bigger scale, more leverage, more change. And I think one thing so Nan and I graduated the same year, and I think we were a little niche in our interest in ESG and impact and climate at that point. And that clearly has just shifted tremendously as the zeitgeist has changed. I would say from my perspective, so I look over ESG and impact at the Carlyle Group. We're a global private investment firm. We have about 290 billion in assets. And I would that we were immediately on a net zero pathway across everything. But a big thing about the Settling Climate Accounts book that Alicia and Tom edited is, does the math add up? And when I think about our global portfolio, there are two ways to go about net zero. There's the easy way and there's a hard way. And the easy way is portfolio magic math. We have about 250 some odd companies globally. The easy portfolio math is, if we divested actually 12 of those companies, we could reduce our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions by 95%. That is an easy way to appease stakeholders and the pressure of saying you have to get net zero. That also does not change a single molecule of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The hard way is to help individual companies get onto decarbonization pathways. And that is challenging because they run the gamut from B2B SaaS companies to heavy industrial manufacturing companies. And so I think one thing I get frustrated with in this kind of dialogue around net zero is that there's an urge to jump to the finish line. And the reality is, when companies come into our portfolio, less than a quarter of them have heard of what their carbon footprint might be, like have any idea what that might be. And so the amount of time we actually have to spend with individual companies of sitting down and saying, do you have a fleet of trucks? Yes, no. Do you have cloud computing? Do you own your office? Do you lease it? Do you have a triple net lease? Scraping through utility bill PDFs from Minnesota factories to get baseline data. Like, we have to start there if we have any chance of actually getting good data of how to get from here to there. So I don't know if that was helpful, but I would say the net zero conversation in investing, we cannot focus on portfolio level emissions. We have to focus on the delta in individual companies. And more importantly, actually building their capacity so they can get on those decarb trajectories on their own.
That's fascinating, and we'll come back to it. But I want to ask you one other quick thing before we shift to Nan, which is that there was a recent announcement from Carlyle and a number of other companies about a kind of a broad cross-corporate effort to come up with metrics that are comparable and to which everyone can, or by which everyone can play, on the theory that right now the rules of the game are so different that no one can plausibly assess who's where in the game or the race. What's the hardest thing so far about coming up with a set of common metrics?
Herding cats. The work you're referencing, Jeff, it's called the ESG Data Convergence Project. There's no rocket science to it. It's not a new framework. It's not a new protocol. It is a group of global general partners and limited partners coming together and saying we all have the same end objective, a smaller set of comparable performance-based quantitative data on topics like climate change. But to get there, we've been running a million different directions. And so we just locked ourselves in a Zoom room for about a year to negotiate on saying, we know how to measure carbon emissions. Can we all agree to measure them using the exact same definition, the same financial normalization metrics at the same time of year? And the exciting thing is we've gotten over 90 GPs and LPs have signed on to that. And so we're going to get carbon dioxide, carbon emissions data for more than 1,200 private companies for 2021, and hopefully more on a go-forward basis. And so I think the industry is coming together to say we need this data in a format that is comparable, performance-based, and meaningful. Because if you let us score ourselves, we're each going to have our own ranking system, and we're all going to get A+. So we need that unimpeachable data.
Excellent. So Nan, hi. Do you want to maybe unmute yourself? Welcome.
Yes, hi, thanks.
Hi, yeah, another GSB 15er. So I want to ask you, Nan, something of the same question that I asked Meg, which was how in the panoply of things you could have done about climate, how you ended up at Stripe, and tell everyone briefly, for those who don't know what Stripe is, and then I want us to talk for a little bit about what you're doing with regard to carbon removal at Stripe, because it's a really interesting. It's interesting in and of itself. It's also a really kind of an interesting framework for what corporates might do. But how did you end up there?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been kind of in and out of the climate space for the bulk of my career, always working at for-profit companies. I was at Opower and Nest in the first sort of climate boom back in 2011, 2012. And I essentially read the 2018 IPCC report as I was re-educating myself on sort of the basic math. And one of the things that jumps out is, in addition to emissions reduction, we are now also going to need a huge amount of carbon removal in order to make the math work. And if we sort of think about carbon removal like supply and demand, supply are the companies that are actually doing the carbon removal, demand is customers that are buying the carbon removal. The thing that jumped out to me after reading the 2018 IPCC report was, how are we going to build the demand side market for carbon removal in the absence of policy? There's no intrinsic value of carbon removal, unlike energy. And so there haven't been many buyers. Without the right policy mechanisms in place, this whole ecosystem is sort of stuck in the mud.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but just spend a beat on the absence of policy. Why did you have to assume the absence of policy in what you were planning?
So, I mean, ultimately, policy is going to have to catch up, right? There's no way that we are going to scale carbon removal to where it needs to be without policy. But I am not a policymaker. That is not my area of expertise, and wasn't where I thought that I could have the sort of biggest impact. So really what attracted me to Stripe specifically was Stripe has a bunch of high margin businesses, 2 million plus businesses that use Stripe to do things like process payments and invoicing and essentially running their economic infrastructure. If you can convince a small fraction of those businesses to give some of their revenue, you can actually start to build a pretty large voluntary market for carbon removal to help these technologies scale. So to me, the attraction to Stripe was, this is a pretty amazing opportunity to try and build a large scale voluntary market while we get policy on the right track, which ultimately needs to catch up. But we can sort of use the private sector to get us first base, and then in parallel, use policy to help get us all the way there.
And say one thing, if you would, just about carbon removal as a technology. Why, in surveying all the potential technologies that a company effectively in online financial services like Stripe could get involved in and try to throw its weight behind, both to make money and to presumably make some environmental difference, was carbon removal the one?
Really good question. So, I mean, if we think about climate broadly, there's like only really two things we can do, right? We put CO2 into the air and we can pull it out. And carbon removal is that second lever. We need to pull CO2 out of the sky and ocean and store it somewhere permanently. It's really been quite far behind to date. And the reason that it's interesting to tackle this in the context of Stripe specifically is Stripe has a lot of software businesses. They're not high emitters, right? These are businesses with low emissions, but actually high margins. And so if you sort of take advantage of that fact and you couple it with the fact that carbon removal is really far behind, Stripe has a lot of businesses with not a lot of emissions reduction levers to pull, but a lot of potentially disposable margin to contribute. And you put those two things together, using Stripe to build that market as the sort of leverage point to build that carbon removal market is particularly interesting. Now, I'll underscore and say that, of course, we need to be doing a massive amount of emissions reduction. That's just not the particularly highest leverage point for Stripe specifically. And nobody had been paying attention to carbon removal like we did. We started out with $1 million to carbon removal back in 2019. And that is obviously a drop in the bucket, but it garnered a lot of attention, mostly because this field has been so starved for capital that anybody sort of cared about $1 million in the first place. So it was those sort of data points that we put together that ultimately became the genesis for what is now Stripe Climate, where we are trying to build a large scale market for carbon removal by aggregating funds from users and then using those funds to buy early promising technologies down the cost curve.
Terrific. Okay, so the chat box is filling up wonderfully. I'm not gonna pick on you, Meg, but I'm gonna convey someone picking on you. So I'm just gonna sort of read. Meg, be brave. Why can't you shut down the worst carbon emitting companies or sectors of companies? Take the loss, lobby for a tax write-off. It's a benefit to all. Do you really think, and then we're actually gonna come back to some other people in this conversation. Do you really think legacy industry can be transformed or saved? Carlyle is big enough to make something like that happen. Smaller investors can't. So jump in.
Sure. I would say we need legacy industry to transform and change, because if we snapped our fingers and shut down hydrocarbons today, we would all be sitting in dark offices without our computers on. And I don't say that to greenwash, to say that, hydrocarbons don't need to be phased out, but I think that we need to focus on the supply-demand balance. Nan was talking about that in another sector of the market. we are very much focused on how do you invest in that transformation? Because a lot of times it's the legacy energy companies that have the engineering expertise, that have the CapEx budgets, and have the distribution networks that can be transformed to new age energy companies. There are also some industries and sectors, though, that can't be transformed. So I'll give you one example. We will not invest in coal-fired power generation, full stop, except if there are instances where there are uneconomical coal-fired power plants where we could potentially buy a municipality out of that power purchase agreement, decommission the asset, and repower it to renewables or an alternate use. That, to me, has way more impact than saying we are fully divesting from this sector, we won't touch it because it's hydrocarbon-based. And so I think we need to have an honest and a nuanced discussion about this because we traffic so much in black and white. That's a green company, that's a brown company. Our research has found that if you can take a traditional oil and gas company from 0% revenues from renewables to 40% revenues from renewables over your hold period, you can double your exit multiple because the market is valuing in companies that are seen on that transition pathway, not just static state, green or brown. So I know it's a hard thing to talk about because all of us on this call, I'm assuming, are really focused on climate action. We wish we could transition our energy sources overnight. We need an orderly transition, but we need capital to invest in the transformation for those companies alongside public accountability to make sure that we're actually tracking that carbon efficiency and carbon emissions reduction and reporting that in a way that is Paris aligned.
There's another question here that is somewhat related, but maybe pulls the lens out a bit more. And I'll just sort of paraphrase the question, but it's essentially capitalism runs on short-term interests, not long-term interests. The titans of capitalism are rewarded for short-term gains, not long-term transformations. And if at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is a long-term the need for a long-term transformation, even if that long-term transformation has to be done in a pretty short period of time, how can the incentives be realigned such that the people actually making the decisions believe that that is what behooves them rather than the same old kind of short-term high carbon decision making? Alicia, do you want to jump in on that?
So, I mean, first, I'm very much appreciating this conversation and especially the texture. And this is what I was hoping would happen of Meg and Nan, sharing their experiences, because it is very much the lived experience of the themes that, that we've surfaced in the book. But as you noted, Jeff, this stuff is so much more real when you get examples. And so they're the living examples. On the question of, capitalism and whether capitalism is equipped to address the long-term nature of climate. I mean, this gets back to some points that Tom raised earlier and also the themes in the book, which is to say that, this is ultimately about transitioning systems where near-term decision-making and market-driven decision-making doesn't necessarily align with those transitions and calls back to the need for the state to come back in. So this is where sort of in the detour from Copenhagen to Paris, where we went, policy isn't working, let's do this through markets. It was a well-intended idea that sort of made sense at the time, but as you go farther into this now net zero frame, you can see these challenges that are emerging. For example, in this question of decommissioning, or the decommissioning is actually a better strategy, but divesting of fossil fuel assets in an investment portfolio, that captures the net zero, emissions alignment challenge perfectly, where it looks really good on paper, but does nothing to change carbon emissions on the ground. And so the need for system level accounting and accountability is what's ultimately going to drive the transition. And you're seeing, a lot of leaders of the capitalist system, whether it's Larry Fink or Mark Benioff, writing, essays around the need to reimagine capitalism. And Rebecca Henderson at Harvard's actually has written a book on this, and it's one of my favorites. And it's about changing the rules of the road and the value systems that are driving sort of company valuation. And this is now playing out really in Europe, where you've got this question of, as we start to standardize data and accounting frameworks, are we going to take into consideration what is being called double materiality, where it's not just the impact of a climate or environmental externalities on the company, but a company's impact on those on the environment. And these are questions now that are at the core of the future of carbon accounting, about how are we going to change the flow of information so that we're driving towards these long-term outcomes within the capitalist system. And that's still an open question, but certainly calls for the need for the state to come back in and play its role of long-term thinking, because ultimately these costs are borne by the state.
We've got about 25 minutes left, and I want to kind of pull back, and I want us collectively to march through this in a somewhat kind of methodical, chronological way, because I want to make sure that at the end of this, people have a sense of the arc of what has happened with the effort to deal with climate change through money, and what has not yet happened, but many of you are arguing must happen. And I just want to posit, because I see questions about this in the chat, why we're here talking about private capital's action rather than government's action. And I'll just say very quickly that if you look at any study about the bringing to bear of money to deal with decarbonization, there's vast agreement that that in the best possible circumstances, there's enough public money only to be catalytic. That at the end of the day, private money is what's going to have to flow in order to change the system. That's at least the predicate. So I want to, Tom, I want to come back to you and ask you. There seems in the chat to be real skepticism about the notion that I think basically that capitalism indeed can change, that the legacy industries can change or feel in any sense the need to change. And Meg made the point earlier that if they don't change, effectively, we're all toast. And so you've done a lot of work over the years with those companies and continue to do, and know people who are leading them. Give us a sense of their importance in this calculus, and also the extent to which you think they are changing or are not changing, and why.
Jeff, good questions all. And I'm not sure it's capitalism per se. We have all kinds of varieties of economies out in the world. Many of them are dominated by market structures, and we call them capitalists. Many of them remain dominated by state structures. Sometimes we call those state capitalists. I think the problem is between incumbency and change, much more than it is between what the particular nature of market or state-driven allocation is. It's the first question. On the question of governments, we just have to remember that the reason we got into these issues with net zero and with green finance was because the multilateral negotiations between governments stalled out and failed in 2009. The original vision for dealing with climate was almost entirely state structured, and I think it's a bit unrealistic to now turn around and say, gee, it's the private sector's fault, it's industry's fault, when green finance was basically built on a perception that the policy had failed in the first place at the multilateral level, but that relative prices in areas like renewables and EVs were falling very rapidly, and that the markets would pick up the lowest cost opportunities. And in many ways they have. Net zero, obviously, shifting the focus to corporate and financial actors, in part because even in the most state-driven economies, incumbents can really create serious problems for change, and we could go on that. I think to answer your question in the most brief possible but way, is that where are we after COP26? No one really knows. Is the glass half full? Is it half empty? But what's clear is that for the moment, private action dominates forward motion rather than state action, that net zero is ascendant. And as Meg and Nan said, we are experiencing a proliferation of private action behavior in the exponential multiplication of data, ledgers, scorecards. Somebody has to sort this out, or else we have a completely non-comparable set of relevant behavior, which is behind a million paywalls because information has gotten more and more valuable. And of course, people throw up paywalls around that. And I think that that in the criticisms that Meg was offering, there is an expanding sense that emissions, offsets, renewable energy credits are not going to take us in the direction where we need to go. And we do need to think more about a much more systemic view in the future. The main point is where we have come is really business as usual in an economy that is already undergoing innovation. Prices, relative prices are changing. If we build new, we build green. But under low macro conditions, low growth, the speed of that transformation is not effective in the time frames we have for climate. We do not have the institutions at the central government levels to lead this, although it is absolutely necessary that there be strong public as well as private action. And my last point is where we need investment is in the emerging economies, in particular in Asia, much less in this country, because in this country and in Europe, the relative price of low carbon solutions has fallen, so that if we build new, we do build green. Investment in new green in this country is largely not additional. It's the countries where you do not have natural gas, where the fleet of energy and transport is effectively brand new and unamortized, where there are very substantial regulatory risks to private capital, and where under the heavy levels of debt that we now see throughout the world, there is simply not public finance to support infrastructure growth at the speed and levels that are necessary. So I don't think it's capitalism. I think it is the incentives of incumbency under low growth that we have to seriously confront. And excuse me for taking so much time.
No, that's fine. I mean, we'll come back, and I think actually we should spend the bulk of the rest of the time on effectively the nuts and bolts of this transition, of the transition largely of incumbent industries. And Nan and Meg, I want to make sure to bring the two of you in here because you're effectively living the effort to affect this transition in a way that passes in a dollars and cents way. But I want to ask one thing before we do that, because there is, anyone look at the chat. I mean, there is both in the chat and in the world, just massive skepticism that this net zero stuff is anything other than green Kool-Aid. And I guess I want to just ask a really basic question here, which is, what of all of this is snake oil? What keeps Meg, Nan, what keeps you both up at night, worrying that you're going to make promises, your colleagues and bosses are going to make promises that are going to be found out to be bunk? And more broadly, Alicia and Tom, anyone who wants to jump in here, I mean, what's just kind of hokum here? Let's be very blunt about what the dangers here are before we get to the methodical effort to ensure that they don't rule the day. Who wants to jump in? Meg, I see you literally biting your tongue, so why don't you jump in?
I would say what's hokum. We spent a lot of time as an industry talking about greenwashing, and that actually frustrates me. I would rather us spend time about the people who aren't purporting to do anything. I think we spent a lot of time picking apart the specific detail of a single calculate. Like, we need to all be running at this as hard and as fast as we can, and we need to leave space for failure. Because if we don't leave space for failure, it means we're setting goals that aren't that ambitious. And so I do think as an industry, we need to get out of this black and white thinking and say, we're going to have some things that work and some things that don't work, and we need to be open about that.
So your sense is that it's more failure after legitimate effort than it is lack of effort masquerading as effort.
I would say we're spending too much time focusing on subtle intricacies and nuances and not enough time on the big picture of like, let's all run. And the market is smart and market participants are smart, and we'll be able to sort through who is slapping a net zero target without having any idea of how to get there versus who's slapping a net zero target on. The reality is none of us know how to get to net zero for most companies. So you can make that long-term pathway. You need very clear near-term targets, and you need to be able to map out the known unknown. And so it's okay to have some level of uncertainty because most of our companies, their carbon intensity is here today. We need it to get here by 2050. We know how to maybe get here. We don't know the rest of it, and that's okay. But as long as we're making those commitments, we're transparent, we're putting it out into the world, then we'll be able to hold people accountable. But I've seen a lot in the chat box about this idea of conventional energy companies. And I just want to emphasize there the scale of the capital to reinvest in clean energy solutions. We have one company, for example, Neptune. Neptune's a really large international oil and gas company. And they produce around 140,000 barrels of oil a day. They're a big company. We need companies like Neptune to be on the forefront of the energy transition because shutting them down is not feasible, and that's not how capital markets work, unfortunately. Neptune's carbon dioxide emissions efficiency is around 6 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel of oil. The industry average is around 18. Neptune has a goal of 0% methane emissions by 2030. To get there, we hooked them up with the Environmental Defense Fund, and I would say oil and gas companies and environmental NGOs don't necessarily get along. They do when we're trying to solve issues like this. And so the EDF scientists are on site, they're using drones, they're flying them over the infrastructure to more quickly identify and prevent methane leakage. More importantly, Neptune is investing significant amounts of capital into green hydrogen, into carbon capture, into the technologies that we need. Because if you look at the most aggressive IEA net zero scenario, so IEA kind of market standard of energy projections, oil and gas is still a part of our energy mix for the next 2 to 3 decades. And so there's this kind of whole supply demand issue of we need to have an energy transition that is just that. It's a transition, it's not a revolution. And I maybe I sound like a broken record, but I think we've lost the nuance on how to set really clear and really kind of performance-based targets that are reflective of our energy reality today. And then projections like the IEA net zero scenario of where we need to get over the next few decades to get down to net zero by 2050.
Allegra, I just want to see if it's possible in any way to capture some of these questions in the chat that we're not going to be able to get to, but that are really, really meaty and fascinating and potentially fodder for more GSV discussion at some future date. Really, really thoughtful stuff. Before we leave the greenwashing point, anyone else want to jump in on what worries you, Alicia?
Yeah, well, I'll just chime in. I mean, I feel like, Nan said it really well. I think, we can't make the perfect the enemy of the good. I think you can sort of spot the greenwashing of snake oil is if someone, making it look easy and not providing the details. I mean, I think Meg's a good spokesperson for, how hard this is and how to do it with integrity. I also think, that there's, she's of a generation of students and practitioners who have come up with this profound understanding of the problem and are time capsules. And essentially, they're living it through the course of their lives. And so there's just an integrity and an awareness to the approach of this generation, frankly, to these challenges. I mean, I will say, I think, so the snake oils, can be as much sins of omission or lack of understanding as like real peddling. I think where you get into real peddling potentially are in some of the, public equity products that are just promising alpha on, sustainability metrics that are all we can get in, all the ways the data is kind of manipulated, as Meg said, everyone can sort of get their A+ if they shop their standards around long enough. So I think that's an area of a bit of beware. I mean, I think offsets, unfortunately, having grown up building the first wave of the voluntary offset market in the US can have some of that too. I think there's real concern there. But I think, this not making the perfect enemy good is an important piece of it. But we've got to get the data and the conventions around the data in better shape so that those well-intended actors can meet their goals and deliver on the specificity that should be there too, with interim targets and transition plans and transparency and attestation around what it is that they're doing.
So let's shift to that, and Nan, I want to come back to you in a second because I'm curious about what I want us to talk about for a few minutes is actually that toolkit of things to build a robust effort to decarbonize. And I want to talk about it first at the 30,000 foot level, and then Nan, I'd love to come back to you and sort of have you truth test us on what that's like in a real company where you're trying to put this stuff into practice. But Alicia, Tom, maybe you want to talk a little bit more. I mean, the book goes into great detail on this, but spend a couple minutes, either of you, both of you, talking about the tools that are important to use to build a robust effort to decarbonize finance, and your sense of where those tools are not now being used the way they ought to be used and how to change that. And we'll spend a grand total of 5 or 6 minutes on this.
Yeah, I'll pick up Jeff a little bit and try and set up the other answer. I think there are a number of levels at which we have to proceed. At the levels that we address in the book of the technologies of accounting, I think that we have to begin to create ledgers or accounting systems for what is creditable action that add up and are correlated with the carbon budgets that are available. Someone said that earlier, I think it was Meg, but we've multiplied these ledgers, and I think there is work to do within the system, both to prevent the worst excesses of gaming. So some stuff at the level of the ledgers themselves. There has to be a shift on another sense that we introduce in the notion of accounts, which is who is accountable. I think there are limits to what you can do through private governance, different institutional systems around the world, but there has to be coordination, and we could talk about exactly how to do that, both in diplomatic sense and in terms of how do you manage at the national level, maybe the way we did in World War II, transforming an economy under very rapid conditions of acceleration. There are no institutions. People turn to central banks, but central banks are not going to carry that on, although they have great capacities. There needs to be institutional shift. And then finally, at the high level, we have to really think about both the analytics and the toolkits that are available for companies and for everyone who is participating in this system to think through the problem of a transition that has to occur in a series of short time intervals, 2030, 2035. We can't have a situation where people promise great technological change in 2040 to wipe out emissions and use a bunch of offsets and renewable energy credits for the next 20 years to deal with a system that is really not changing. That is a responsibility for everyone. And I think that the way you start that is by using the types of risk analytics that companies use all the time for dealing with other risks in the system. There are short-term risks here that are physical, that are to be managed well through different types of insurance, innovative. There are longer-term risks of a transition that are to be managed in a variety of ways, probably not through seeking alpha, but by hedging those risks in the shorter run and moving your thinking about your overall portfolio of how you manage assets. And finally, there will be sovereign risk change over the next 10 to 15 years. It will increase because so much of the risk of climate ends up on the books of the sovereign. And they will have to begin to respond to move those risks back to those companies who can manage them efficiently. So everything will be shifting, and the best point is to think about the risks that are currently available and the transition risks that will certainly be upon you, and to develop analytic structures that are built more on financial risk analysis, more on granular work than on the types of macro analysis that we currently see dominating climate change. A bunch of cryptic answers, Jeff, but you asked a cryptic question.
No, not cryptic at all. No, that's really helpful. I mean, so let's do this. Tom kind of talked at 20,000 feet. Alicia, let me shift to you for a second to talk at maybe 10,000 feet. And I'm gonna actually ask this a little more specifically since we're running out of time. But I was just looking at the table of contents of your book, and there's a chapter in the book that talks about that Mark Roston wrote, the road from scope 3 to net zero. So it strikes me that one of the examples of stuff that needs to get figured out here is what companies are talking about when they talk about net zero. I mean, where they're drawing the circle, as it were, whose emissions they're counting and whose emissions they're not counting. So and let's do this as an exercise that's illustrative. Talk about the difficulty of that and what seems promising or what needs to happen. Let's do it this way. What needs to happen in terms of getting some clarity about where to draw the circles that is not happening? And do you have much hope that it'll happen? And then, Nan, we shift to you.
Yeah, I want to bring Nan into this because she lives it every day. I mean, I think the questions of coverage and boundaries are really challenging. And we've lived this, I was advised the governor of California in this climate risk disclosure advisory group in making recommendations for where to draw this line for the state. Do we include scope, we included scope 1 and 2, do we include scope 3? And we landed on yes, because as sort of to Meg's point, you got to learn by doing. And we've got, it's the majority of emissions for most, companies.
So let's just to define terms for people. So if we're talking about an auto company, scope 3 emissions are when Alicia drives a car or I drive a car.
That's right.
Not the emissions that happen when our car is built or other emissions. Go ahead. Sorry.
Right. Well, and so what's interesting about scope 3 is it's essentially like governments have basically, left pricing decisions in the hands of private firms. And scope 3 is essentially the exercise, the decisions around managing scope 3 are essentially an individual company or private actors price discovery of what, how they think about the price of carbon and how they're going to move their assets around accordingly. And you saw this, the auto companies are an interesting example because we kind of saw this play out with the US auto manufacturers in the Trump administration, where they were aligning around the California auto emission standards, and the Trump administration didn't want to see emission standards governed or essentially priced at the state or the corporate level. And this is what's happening. Take the tech companies who have, their emissions are essentially zero in the US, but in Asia, where their supply chains exist or where their growth exists, whether it's, data centers or manufacturing hardware supply chains, they're going to be running into questions of management of carbon emissions and pricing carbon emissions in foreign jurisdictions. And so you have real challenges around these boundaries and how that's going to work politically. With where you're running into to state decision making and state diplomacy. So they're tricky questions. I mean, and just to make it even more complicated, to take a step back, I mean, the GHG accounting protocol was built by scientists, right? It wasn't built by investors for this purpose. And so there actually is work being done to reconsider carbon accounting entirely around, liabilities and assets, and doing activity-based accounting for emissions to better account for how emissions actually transfer through supply chains and through markets. That in many ways, I just complicated your question more than answered it. But to then come back to this question of, is there hope? I mean, I think there's always hope. We can always do a better job than we've been doing. But I think we're in an interesting moment now where we're going to have to see whether we try and stretch the tools of yesteryear into demands that these systems weren't necessarily built to tackle, or are we going to reimagine carbon accounting in ways that actually tackle some of the challenges that have emerged as the private sector has kind of taken over carbon accounting, and as we try and reconcile those ledgers with state ledgers?
Good. So Nan, you're living at least some of this every day. What about this nut of accounting is hard? I mean, what are you dealing with? To what extent do these academic questions about where one draws lines and how one accounts actually come front and center to dollars and cents decisions that you and your colleagues at Stripe are making? Examples, a couple examples would be great. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I'm a little bit of the view that we're not going to solve climate change with, bits. We have to move actual atoms to solve this thing. So we really don't focus too much in the accounting. I think our perspective is like take an 80-20 approach with our own emissions and then use that to directionally guide what we do. To get money into the pot for our end users, we don't even do any footprinting at all. We just let them allocate a fraction of their revenue. And like a lot of businesses, they just want this to be easy. Their default is to do nothing. And if you can make it really easy for them, they'll put something into the pot. And accounting is hard because you have to sort of catalog all of these, and it's not to say it's not important. It is important. But I think I sort of worry about too much emphasis on the over emphasis on getting the numbers exactly right when like we directionally know what we need to do. So like, let's just go do those things. So we don't place too much emphasis on the accounting piece.
Okay. So last question, you graduated from the GSB 6 years ago. You're, I don't know, roughly 30 or so, maybe. Yeah. I mean, So I guess I don't want to be too corny, but I want to end on this. We're right at our time, but I want to end on this question that Alicia flecked out, which is hope. At the end of the day, we've talked a lot about numbers, and you've just told us to play the long game and look at the incentive for big movement where big movement ain't happening. And I guess I'm just wondering, you think it's going to happen?
I do. I mean, I think there are more talented folks and more sectors getting involved in climate than we've ever seen before. And I do think that we are going to be able to innovate our way out of this, certainly on the emissions reduction side and on the carbon removal side. I think the mind shift is this isn't 30 years that we have. We essentially have 3 to 5 years to, get our act together. And if we think about it as leading indicators rather than lagging indicators, it is, what are you going to do in those 3 to 5 years to really jumpstart carbon removal, emissions reductions, anything we want to do on the geoengineering side to learn what tools are going to need to be in our toolkit over the coming decades. But I think that we can figure this out. I really do. We are an innovative species. We have the potential to do this, but it's a lot of work in both coming up with new solutions and deploying those solutions. And so I think that the more we can, to Meg's point, run at this thing and not let perfect be the enemy of good, and sort of recognize that there's a very high discount rate here. Like, we need to move quickly. I think that is ultimately what will make sure that we are on the best possible trajectory in the next couple of years.
Terrific. Thank you to Alicia. Thank you to Tom. Thank you to Meg. Thank you to Nan for doing what I figured what was going to happen, is teeing up lots of interesting stuff that we didn't have time to plumb as deeply as we would have liked to, but at least this sets the table. And I will just say that the book is out there, Settling Climate Accounts. You can find it on Amazon. I'm not an author or an editor, so I can just tell you unashamedly, go buy the book. And second of all, if any of you have looked through the chat during the course of this hour, you'll see something that probably won't surprise you if you're affiliated with Stanford, or more specifically the GSB, which is that there are a hell of a lot of smart questions here and experiences here. And I would just say that it seems to me that there's a lot of room for additional discussion